Newtown, Aurora, Charleston, Orlando. What is the tipping point? Are we blind? Can we see? How many more mothers, how many more fathers need to shed tears of grief before we do something?
That Democratic Georgia Congressman and civil rights icon John Lewis demanding action on gun control. He led a sit-in on the floor of Congress earlier today, but so far the legislative branch hasn't done anything. We know what happened in the Senate. They voted on 4 measures, all of which failing earlier this week after a filibuster. And the House, I'll be surprised, frankly, if there are any votes here on some meaningful gun control legislation. But the judicial branch, they just did something about guns by, frankly, doing nothing about guns, specifically New York's and Connecticut's ban on semi-automatic weapons and large capacity magazines. The Supreme Court decided against taking up a Second Amendment challenge to those laws. Here's how the Times editorial board summed it up. Quote, with those denials, the latest of more than 70 rejections of challenges to gun regulations, the justices have made it clear that reasonable gun control laws are fully consistent with the Second Amendment rights. You know, Jim, at this point, it just feels like rinse and repeat. We've done this before. 21st graders are killed in broad daylight, and that won't move a nation to do something. And now we see in Orlando, and yet again, they finally forced a vote. I naively thought last Friday that would at least stop the no-fly list, people on a no-fly list, to be able to purchase a gun. I was proven wrong. I don't know what will. I do notice politically, which is my world, that you're going to see people campaigning against people who will vote, at least on record, as voting against banning terror watch list folks from being able to get a gun. That's going to be a political issue where less than 15 years ago people ran away from it. So that's my world. But from the legal world, Supreme Court said, no, New York and Connecticut, they didn't go too far. You can still have a right to bear arms, but they put limitations on it. Does that mean anything, or is it just going to be a state-by-state here and there, and we're going to have basically 50 different sets of rules in this country?
I think it does mean something because the Supreme Court is basically saying to the other states, if you were to impose similar restrictions as these 2 states, don't expect us to do anything about it. So it does say something. But that is an incremental approach that's going to go state by state, and it's going to be different from one state to another.
It basically validated Heller, right?
It did. It did. It's inexplicable. I don't get it. You're not allowed to own a machine gun. Machine guns are banned, right? So what's the problem? What is the legal issue about banning assault rifles?
They'll make the distinction, you've heard this before, but that one is there's a distinction between semi-automatic and automatic weapons, and that there's a distinction with the difference. We've had experts on who talks about with the minimum modifications that you can't do. How
it's a weapon of war.
I know.
It's a weapon of war. I don't see the distinction.
The three of us, we're preaching to the choir.
But the Supreme Court is saying,
yeah,
legislative branch, you're not going to do anything, and that's a shame. But the Supreme Court is saying to the rest of the states, these are fine.
But even in New York State, there's certain knives you can't possess. You can't have a gravity knife.
It's
I mean,
insane.
really, who's going to go and kill a lot of people with a gravity knife?
But here, guys, is my question as a table. Listen, 90% of Americans believe that there should be universal background checks. Almost 82% of gun owners believe if you're on a terror watch list, you shouldn't be able to get a gun. And almost 3/4 of gun owners believe in a background check, members of the NRA, okay? So I know what the public will is on this, on a national thing. We also know, the 4 of us, that if you have background checks but they're not universal across the country, they're really not worth that much. Because if you can buy a gun in one state without being checked and cross the border, or they call it the iron pipeline for a reason. People move guns up into the northeastern states from other places with lax gun laws. But, and I'll start with you, Doug, and we'll go around. There's a case right now in Connecticut, we talked about in this program, where they wanted to sue the gun manufacturer, who have, as an industry, the only blanket liability, non-liability, as any industry does, where they're not responsible for the products that they create or how they're used. What could legally be done that you haven't seen done yet that would curb gun violence, access to certain guns, the absence of good checking of it. I'm not talking through a legislative way. Is there a judicial channel you've been surprised hasn't been tried, whether it be by a DA, a U.S. attorney, a commander-in-chief, whatever the case may be?
Well, Rich, I mean, I'm a lawyer. I'm looking at the cases that people are filing. I mean, you're talking about this case in Connecticut, Newtown. I mean, there's a federal law in place that protects gun manufacturers from liability when their weapons are used in a criminal act. To me, that's incredible. That means that the elected officials in this country came out and said, we are going to protect the gun companies. So when we're talking about the will of the people to actually do something here, you're seeing your elected officials actually go the other way to say that no matter what, there is no liability for these gun manufacturers. Now, that's not a political statement, that's a law that's been passed. Now you have a lawyer in Connecticut who's trying to bring lawsuits, and he's trying to find exceptions to that law. So if you're talking about what can actually bring, there have been doors that have been shut on plaintiffs' lawyers who are trying to bring these lawsuits. There have been cases that have been successful in federal court years ago that have been thrown out by federal courts. So really, you're not looking for new ways, you're just trying to protect the stuff that actually exists now.
Well, we're talking about these numbers, and the numbers across the board, over 75% of the people in the country are in favor of these restrictions and the basic checks in terms of mental health, whether you're on a terror watch. Those people don't vote. That's what you're being told. They don't vote. They're not going to go out and vote any of these people out. So it doesn't really matter. Polls and all these things are one thing, but if we don't participate.
Vote, but this is not the voting. This is not the issue that will determine their vote, while for certain gun owners it is.
Right. Well, but also going back to the question for Doug, look, if you tax ammunition, make it expensive enough, then you'll see a change, just like with cigarettes, okay? And it's no longer cheap and easy to get ammunition. It's no longer cheap and easy to get the guns. Maybe the registration, the particular gun's got to be tied to you. There are a host of different things that can be done.
That's legislative in terms of whether it be from a taxation standpoint or from a regulation. But what I'm saying is, if you went after a gun dealer and said, a person walked in, forget about what the law requires you to do, you'd use no discretion or prudence here. You're not keeping good track record of where all your guns are or whatever else. If there was enough of that, people would say, listen, I want to make a buck, but I'm not going to do this. I'm going to get harassed every time somebody comes in here. I'm going to be a little bit more careful. Forget about what I believe or don't believe about where the Second Amendment starts or ends. It's business. Is there a way to, from a commercial standpoint through lawsuits, where it's going to incentivize the gun sellers that they don't need this in their life? Well, because right now they're not worried about the ramifications for what happens once they sell the gun.
You need a law in order to break it. And that's the problem. So there's no question, if the legislature would finally act and impose these restrictions, impose these requirements, then there are laws that, if broken, a DA can act on. And like Doug was saying, if the legislature has said you have no liability, there's no loophole to that. Yep. You have no liability.
Imagine if you could only buy guns from the government, almost like the ABC stores, where the only place you could buy alcohol is from there.
Well, that will never happen. I mean, the Second Amendment did say one thing about a militia, however we view it. That won't happen. I give you points for trying, but I wouldn't hold your breath. All right. Now, this one, I'm sure the three of you have an opinion on, because maybe it will impact one of your clients down the road. Supreme Court ruled, and it's a major ruling, it'll give the police broad new powers when it comes to search and seizure. You got an open warrant, it's a whole new world. Stay with us.